My name is Renata Voss, and I was 31 years old the night my father looked my boyfriend in the eye and told him I would never amount to anything. We were standing in my parents' kitchen, the one with the yellow curtains my mother has never changed and the calendar that always runs a month behind. Marcus had come for Sunday dinner for the third time. He was nervous in that quiet, careful way he had, complimenting the pot roast, helping clear dishes without being asked. My father watched him the way he watched everything, with the slow, measuring patience of a man who had already decided what he thought. And then, while I was in the next room, I heard it. She plays at cooking, Marcus. That's what she does. It's a hobby. She'll never amount to anything real. I stood in the hallway with a stack of plates, and I did not move. Marcus said something low that I couldn't hear. My father said, "I'm telling you, because you seem like a serious man." I set the plates down quietly. I went back into the kitchen. I smiled. I poured the coffee. I kept quiet for 11 years. What my father didn't know, what no one in that family knew, was that I was already building something he had no language for. Welcome back, channel, where quiet people let the paperwork do the talking. If you're new here, hit subscribe, and if you've ever had to prove something to someone who already made up their mind, leave a comment below. This one's for you. I grew up in a house where cooking was maintenance, not ambition. My mother made the same 7 dinners on rotation, and no one complained, because no one thought to. My father worked in municipal permitting for 31 years. He reviewed blueprints, approved plans, signed his name on documents that let buildings exist. He believed in credentials you could frame, in titles that fit on a business card, in jobs that came with lanyards and parking spots. He was not a cruel man. He was a certain one. And certainty, in my experience, does more lasting damage than cruelty, because at least cruelty knows it's inflicting something. I was the middle of 3 children. My older brother Dennis went into civil engineering. He is, to this day, my father's favorite topic of conversation at any gathering that involves other men. My younger sister Petra went into pharmaceutical sales, which my father described as practically medicine. And then there was me. I wanted to cook. Not the way children want things, as a feeling that passes. I wanted it the way some people want to breathe in a specific kind of air. I was 9 years old when I first understood that a sauce could be built in stages, that patience applied to butter and shallots produced something entirely different from hurry applied to the same ingredients. Our neighbor, Mrs. Halvorsen, was 74 and had cooked professionally in Oslo before she immigrated, and she let me sit on a stool in her kitchen on Saturday mornings and watch. She never talked down to me. She handed me a spoon and said, "Taste this, now taste this. Tell me what changed." She was the first person who treated what I noticed as information worth having. My father called it spending time with the old lady down the street. He wasn't dismissive out of malice. He genuinely could not map what I was doing onto anything he recognized as a future. Cooking, to him, was something women did at home or something men did in diners. Neither version produced a career. Neither version produced a pension. When I was 14 and told him I wanted to go to culinary school, he nodded slowly in the way he nodded when he was deciding not to argue, not because he agreed, but because he thought the idea would dissolve on its own. It didn't. I graduated high school with decent grades and a clear sense of exactly one thing I wanted to do. My father sat me down the summer before I turned 18 and laid out what he called the practical reality. Dennis was finishing his engineering degree. Petra was starting pre-pharmacy. College tuition for 3 children on a municipal salary required prioritization. He said that word, prioritization, carefully, the way you say a word when you've been rehearsing it. He wasn't saying no, he told me. He was saying that culinary school was expensive and its outcomes were uncertain, and that if I wanted to pursue it, I would need to find my own way. I said okay. I meant it. I worked 2 jobs the year after high school. Mornings at a bakery in town, evenings waiting tables at a mid-range Italian place off the highway. I saved every dollar that didn't go to rent. I applied to the regional culinary program at the state college, which was affordable and serious and not glamorous in any way that would have impressed anyone at a dinner party. I was accepted. I enrolled. I told my parents at Sunday dinner, and my mother said she was glad I had a plan, and my father said he hoped I knew what I was getting into. He asked once, only once, what I thought the job market looked like for culinary graduates. I told him I'd done the research. He nodded and asked Dennis how the structural load calculations were going. The thing about culinary school, the real thing, the one they don't put in the brochure, is that it filters hard and it filters fast. By the end of the first semester, roughly a third of my cohort had quietly stopped showing up. Not because they were told to leave, but because the gap between loving food and being able to perform under pressure consistently at pace without breaking turned out to be a gap some people couldn't close. I could close it. I don't say that to sound extraordinary. I say it because it surprised me too. I had always known I loved cooking. I had not known until those first weeks whether I could do it in conditions that had nothing romantic about them. 6 a.m. prep, instructors who graded on silence as much as technique, the specific humiliation of being corrected in front of 12 peers who were also being corrected and still somehow felt like an audience. I came home to my apartment after a particularly brutal Thursday in my second month, sat on the edge of my bed, and thought, I can do this. Not as a wish. As a fact I had just confirmed. I graduated in the top tier of my program. My instructor, Chef Ambrosetti, a woman who had cooked in 4 countries and had the handshake of someone who had carried stock pots for 20 years, pulled me aside at the end of finals and said, "You don't show off. That's rarer than talent." I wrote it down in a notebook I still have. I told my parents about the graduation with about the same ceremony as I would have announced a dental appointment. My father said he was glad it had worked out. My mother made a nice dinner. Dennis called from his apartment and said congratulations. Petra sent a card with a cartoon chef on it that I think she found funny, and I did not mention either way. Then I went to work. The kitchen world is not soft. I knew that going in, and I found out in more specific ways once I was inside it. I started as a line cook at a respected regional restaurant. Not famous, not a destination, but serious. The kind of place where the chef owned it and also worked every service and would pull a dish back and redo it himself rather than let something wrong go to a table. I worked under him for 3 years. I learned more in that kitchen than I had in any classroom, and I mean that with full respect to my classroom. I moved up, left, moved to a larger operation in the city, worked guard manger, then sauté, then eventually sous chef. I was methodical about it. I was not interested in being noticed. I was interested in being good. Along the way, I started studying for the certifications. In the culinary world, there is a hierarchy of formal credentials, and at the top of the civilian professional ladder in the United States sits the Certified Master Chef designation, administered by the American Culinary Federation, requiring years of documented experience, letters of recommendation from certified peers, and a grueling 8-day practical examination that tests everything from classical technique to nutritional science to menu costing under time conditions. The pass rate across its history is under 25%. There are, at any given time, somewhere between 30 and 40 individuals in the country who hold it. I did not tell anyone I was pursuing it. Not Marcus. Not my colleagues. Not my parents. Not Dennis. Not Petra. I studied on my days off. I documented my experience hours with the quiet bureaucratic patience I had apparently learned, without knowing it, from watching my father process permits. I applied. I was accepted to sit the exam. I traveled to the testing facility, and I cooked for 8 days in front of evaluators who had seen every possible way a person could fail, and I did not fail. The letter came on a Wednesday morning. I read it twice. I folded it. I put it in the drawer with the lease and the tax documents. Then I made a cup of coffee and went to work. Mrs. Halvorson had died for years before any of this. She went quietly in the home she had lived in for 40 years, and I went to the small service her family held and stood in the back and thought about Saturday mornings and the smell of browning butter and the way she had handed me a spoon like it was the most natural thing. I didn't cry at the service. My throat did something I couldn't quite name, and I stood very still until it passed. I had told her, toward the end, that I was cooking professionally. She had squeezed my hand and said, in the slightly formal English she used for important statements, "You always could taste the difference. That is not a skill that is taught." I think about that a lot. She was the anchor the channel formula asks for, but she was also just a neighbor who gave a child time and a spoon, and the assumption that what the child noticed was worth noticing. I have met, in my adult life, very few people who give children that assumption. It is worth more than most people know. The Marcus situation began, as these things often do, not with a single event, but with a pattern that became impossible to ignore once I had seen its shape. Marcus Teal was 34 when we met, a quiet, organized man who worked in commercial real estate appraisal and had the slightly careful manner of someone who had learned early that precision prevents problems. He was not flashy. He did not fill rooms. He read before bed and kept a grocery list on his phone and could have a conversation with almost anyone without making it about himself, which is a quality I find underrated to the point of near extinction in adult men. We met through mutual friends at a gathering I had almost skipped. We talked about food, specifically about why so many restaurants that should be good aren't, and he had actual opinions rather than the performative ones people produce when they find out you cook professionally. He asked about technique with the genuine curiosity of someone who wanted to understand, not impress. We dated for 4 months before I brought him to Sunday dinner. I should have prepared him better. I understand that now. My father received Marcus with the measured cordiality he applied to anyone new, not warm, not cold, precisely calibrated to withhold judgment while gathering data. He asked about Marcus's work with the focused attention he gave anything involving property and documents, which I noticed immediately and which Marcus probably found reassuring. My mother was cheerful in the way she was always cheerful at Sunday dinners, which was to say she kept the conversation moving and the plates full and did not let silences last long enough to become meaningful. Dennis wasn't there that first Sunday. Petra was with her husband Tomas, and she was pleasant to Marcus in the slightly patronizing way she was pleasant to everyone outside her immediate social circle, friendly on the surface, evaluating underneath. The dinner was fine. Marcus said so on the drive home, and I could hear in his voice that he meant it, which meant he hadn't caught what I had caught. The way my father's eyes had moved between Marcus and me with the specific calculation of a man doing math on something that concerned him. The second Sunday was the same. And the third. And then came the evening I described at the beginning. I was in the hallway with the plates. My father and Marcus were in the kitchen. My mother and Petra were in the dining room talking about something I wasn't tracking. And my father's voice came through the door with the particular carrying quality of a man who was not trying to be overheard, but was not particularly worried if he was. She plays at cooking, Marcus. That's what she does. I stopped. She always has. Even as a child, she was always in Edna Halvorson's kitchen, learning this and that. It's a hobby. It's always been a hobby. She doesn't have a degree. She works in restaurants. It's not a career, you understand. Not the kind that builds something. Marcus's response was quiet. I couldn't make out the words. I'm telling you, my father said, because you seem like a serious man. I'd want someone to tell me. I stood in that hallway, and I felt something move through my chest, not heat, not cold, but something that went very still, the way a room goes still right after a sound stops. The plates in my hands were heavier than they should have been. I looked at my hands for a moment. I looked at the yellow curtains in the kitchen doorway. I set the plates down on the hallway table. I walked into the kitchen. I smiled at both of them. I said, "Coffee?" My father said that would be nice. Marcus looked at me with a question he didn't ask. I answered it by touching his arm briefly as I passed. I'm fine. We'll talk later. And I poured the coffee and I brought it to the table and I sat down and I ate the last of my mother's pot roast and I kept quiet. In the car on the way home, Marcus asked if I'd heard. I said yes. He said he was sorry. I said there was nothing to be sorry about. He said, Renata, that wasn't okay. I told him I knew. I told him I had known for a long time. I told him there was a particular kind of person who needs you to be small so that their measurement of the world stays accurate, and that my father was that kind of person, and that I had stopped needing him to see me differently somewhere around the time I passed my CMC exam, which was a sentence I had never said out loud to anyone before. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You passed what?" And that was the first time I told him. What followed over the next several years was not dramatic. That is the honest answer. There was no single confrontation, no moment where I stood in the kitchen and said you were wrong. My father continued to exist in the way he always had, certain, measured, privately skeptical of my choices in a way he had long since stopped bothering to fully conceal. He asked about my work the way you ask about something you don't really want the details of. He was not unkind. He was just consistently, reliably, entirely unimpressed. There were smaller moments that accumulated. The Christmas Eve dinner where Petra announced she had been promoted to regional sales director and my father made a toast, an actual toast, with a raised glass, and looked at me afterward with the particular smile of a man including you in a celebration you had no part in. The family gathering where Dennis's firm had just won a municipal contract worth several $100,000 and my father talked about it for 40 minutes and then asked me, with the careful brightness of someone changing subjects, whether the restaurant I was running was doing okay. I was not running a restaurant by then. I had been consulting independently with my own LLC, hired by restaurant groups to troubleshoot menu architecture, train kitchen teams, redesign cost structures. I had 3 long-term clients. My income was higher than Dennis's. My hours were my own. None of this was information my family had asked for, and I had not offered it. My mother, to her credit, always asked if I was happy. Not what I was earning or what my title was, just whether I was happy. I always told her yes, which was true, and she always said that was what mattered, which she also meant. I am not angry at my mother. Marcus and I moved in together after 2 years. We didn't make an announcement. We told our respective families when it was already done, which was how I had learned to handle the things that mattered to me. Do them first, inform people after, let the accomplished fact absorb the objections. My father received this, with the measured nod I had come to know as his signature response to anything he couldn't categorize. My mother seemed genuinely pleased. Petra said our apartment sounded nice, and asked if we had a guest room. Marcus asked me, one night about 6 months after we moved in together, whether I ever intended to tell my family about the certification. I told him I was waiting. He asked what for. I said I wasn't sure exactly, that I'd know when it was the right moment. He said that was the most professional answer I had ever given to a personal question, which was both accurate and affectionate. The year before everything shifted, I took on the largest consulting engagement I'd had to that point, a regional restaurant group that was expanding from 3 locations to 6 and needed their back-of-house systems rebuilt from the ground up before the new locations opened. The project ran 14 months. It involved a full curriculum redesign for their kitchen training program, standardization of every recipe across all locations, development of a cost-tracking system their ownership could actually use, and the thing I was most quietly proud of, a sourcing network I built from scratch that connected them to 12 regional suppliers, which reduced their food cost percentage by nearly 9 points over the first quarter of implementation. The group's majority owner was a man named Gerald Foss, who was in his 60s and had been in the restaurant industry in one form or another since before I was born. He was the kind of businessman who had seen too many consultants to be impressed by credentials on paper and who had, over the course of 14 months, become convinced of exactly one thing, that I knew what I was doing. He wrote me a letter at the close of the engagement. I don't quote it here because it isn't mine to quote, but I kept it. He also, without telling me, nominated me for consideration in a recognition program administered by the state's Hospitality Industry Board, a program that evaluated culinary professionals for documented impact on regional food systems, kitchen labor standards, and professional development. I found out about the nomination 3 months later when I received a letter informing me I had been selected as one of the year's honorees. The ceremony was scheduled for the spring. It was open to the public. Ticket holders could include, if one chose to invite them, one's family. I looked at the invitation for a long time. I thought about the hallway with the plates. I thought about the toast on Christmas Eve. I thought about Marcus asking me what I was waiting for, and my answer that I'd know. I knew. I called my mother that evening and told her I'd been recognized by the State Hospitality Board for my work and that there was a ceremony and that I would love it if the family could come. She said of course, she would tell everyone. I told her Marcus and I would handle the tickets. I did not tell her what else would be at the ceremony. I did not mention the credential verification segment. I did not mention that the program included, for honorees holding national, professional certifications, A formal acknowledgement by a representative of the certifying body, which in my case meant a representative of the American Culinary Federation would be present, with documentation, to confirm on the record that I held the Certified Master Chef designation. I said it was a recognition dinner. I told her to dress nicely. Then I hung up and sat in the kitchen for a few minutes, and did not feel triumphant, and did not feel nervous. I felt the particular quiet of someone who has been patient for a very long time and can now see the end of the patience. The venue was a hotel ballroom in the city, the kind with high ceilings and round tables with linens and the specific air of a room that has been set for something formal. It held perhaps 220 people that evening. Industry professionals, restaurant owners, culinary educators, food journalists, a handful of local elected officials who had been asked to present certificates. Wait staff moved along the walls. The lighting was warm and the sound system was well calibrated, the kind of detail you notice when you've worked events. My family arrived together. My father and mother, Dennis and his wife Claire, Petra and Tomas. They found us near the entrance, and my mother hugged me immediately and said I looked wonderful, and I said thank you, and Marcus shook hands with everyone in the careful, genuine way he had, and we walked to our table together. I watched my father take in a room. He was good at rooms, had been his whole career. He read them the way he read blueprints, looking for the structure, the load-bearing elements, the things that would tell him what the room was really for. I saw him note the formality of it, the size, the mix of people. I saw something recalibrate slightly in his expression, not discomfort, just a slight revision of expectation. He had come, I think, imagining a regional industry thing, the kind of event where you get a plaque and a handshake and a dinner roll. He was now sitting in something larger than that. He said nothing. He sat down. He ordered water and looked at the program. Dennis asked what the evening's format was, and I explained there would be remarks, then the credential verification segment, then individual honorary acknowledgments, then dinner. He nodded. Claire said the centerpieces were beautiful. Petra asked who the other honorees were. I said I honestly wasn't sure, which was true. Marcus sat beside me and put his hand briefly on the table near mine, not touching, just present. I noticed it. I appreciated it. The program began on time. The board chair gave opening remarks about the state of the regional food industry, the labor challenges, the supply chain shifts of recent years, the importance of professional standards as the industry rebuilt. She spoke well. My father listened with the attention he gave to things he considered substantive. This registered as substantive. I could see it. Then, the credential verification segment. The board chair introduced it as a component they had added 3 years ago, in partnership with national certifying bodies, to formally recognize honorees who had achieved the highest levels of professional certification in their field. She explained that a representative from each relevant body would briefly present documentation for the applicable honoree. My father's eyes went to the program. I had been watching the moment he would look at the program, and I saw it happen. He ran his finger down the list of honorees and found my name, Renata Voss, independent culinary consultant, and I watched him read it the way he read everything, with the slow parsing of a man who processes rather than reacts. Then his eyes moved to the notation next to my name. The notation read, CMC, American Culinary Federation. He looked up from the program. He looked at me. I was looking at the stage. The ACF representative was a trim man in his 50s in a dark suit who moved to the podium with the efficient confidence of someone who had done this before and understood its weight. He introduced himself, gave the briefest explanation of the Certified Master Chef designation, the 8-day examination, the documented experience requirements, the pass rate, and then he said my name. Renata Voss completed the examination in the cohort of, and he named the year, which I will not include here, and he said, she holds certification number, and he read the number, and then he said, the Certified Master Chef designation is currently held by 34 individuals in the United States. Ms. Voss has been one of them for, and he named the number of years. He reached into the leather portfolio he was carrying and he removed a laminated card and a folded document, and he walked from the podium toward our table, because I was an honoree and honorees were seated at the front, and he placed both items on the table in front of me with a brief nod and said, on behalf of the American Culinary Federation, congratulations. The document unfolded slightly as he set it down. The letterhead of the ACF was visible. My name was visible. The word certified was visible. My father's hand was resting on the table and I watched it. I could not help watching it, and I saw his fingers go still in the way fingers go still when the hand is not sure what to do with itself. He was looking at the document. Not at me. At the document. My mother made a small sound beside him. Not words, just a sound of breath catching. Dennis had stopped moving his water glass. Petra's fork, which she had picked up in anticipation of salads arriving, was not moving. 220 people in that room. The ACF representative returning to the podium. The board chair beginning to speak again. My family did not make a scene. That is not who they are. They sat in their chairs, and they were very quiet, and the room continued around them. Marcus looked at me. He did not say anything. His eyes said, "There it is." I looked at the stage. I kept my face calm and my hands still, and I breathed normally, and I thought about Saturday mornings in Mrs. Halvorson's kitchen, and the smell of butter going brown and a spoon being handed to me like it was the most natural thing in the world. The honoree acknowledgement segment followed the credential verification. Each honoree was called to the stage to receive a formal recognition from the board and, where applicable, a brief statement from a presenting official. My name was called third. I walked to the stage. I shook the board chair's hand. I received the framed certificate, state seal, my name, the language of formal recognition, and I turned to face the room. 220 people. My family at the table near the front. My father with his hands folded on the table now, his face composed in the careful way of a man who is working very hard at composure. My mother with her hands in her lap and her eyes bright. Dennis with his elbow on the table and his jaw slightly tight. Petra with her chin up at an angle that meant she was controlling something. Tomas looking at the tablecloth. Claire watching me with an expression I could not read, but which I think, if I'm being generous, was the expression of someone revising a prior understanding. And Marcus, with the small, steady smile of someone who has waited a long time for a moment and is allowing himself to feel it. The board chair said a few words. She described the consulting work, the restaurant group, the supplier network, the 9-point reduction in food cost. She said the word impact 3 times and I counted them. She mentioned the ACF certification again and the 34. She said, Ms. Voss has spent over a decade building something exceptional without anyone in this room needing to know about it. That is, in many ways, the mark of a true professional. I thanked the board. I thanked Gerald Voss, who was at a table across the room and who nodded once in the particular way of a man who considers himself even for compliments. I said I was grateful to be recognized in a room full of people who understood the work because the work itself was the thing. And then I said, briefly, without looking at any particular table, that I had started cooking at 9 years old in a neighbor's kitchen and that I was glad I had never stopped and that the people who believed in you early were the ones worth cooking for. I walked back to my seat. I sat down. I put the framed certificate in front of me and the laminated card and the ACF document beside it, and I did not look at my father, and I poured myself a glass of water, and I drank it. Under the table, Marcus put his hand over mine. I let him. The room moved on. The next honoree was being called. The waitstaff was beginning the salad service, and my family continued to sit in the particular silence of people who are processing something they cannot immediately speak about in a public setting. After perhaps 3 minutes, my father said my name, Renata. I turned to look at him. He had the expression of a man who has arrived at a conclusion he did not intend to arrive at and is not yet sure what to do with it. His hands were still folded. His voice was measured, the way his voice was always measured. He said, "How long have you had it?" I told him the number of years. He was quiet for a moment. He said, "You didn't tell us." I said, "No." Another silence. Salads arrived. The server distributed them with the careful efficiency of someone trained not to interrupt, and my family accepted their plates, and the table was briefly occupied with the logistics of salad, and when that settled, my father said, quietly, "I didn't know that existed." I said, "I know." He picked up his fork. He looked at the salad. He said, in a voice that was lower than his speaking voice, the ACF representative said 34. 34. I confirmed. He nodded slowly. One nod. The kind that means, I am incorporating this. He did not apologize. I did not expect him to. My father is not a man who apologizes because he does not generally believe he has been wrong, but he is also a man who responds to documented evidence, and the documentation was on the table in front of me, and he had read every word of it. Something in his accounting had shifted. I could not tell you exactly what. I could tell you that the certainty had gone somewhere, and in its place was something quieter. My mother reached across and put her hand on my arm. She said, I'm so proud of you, Renata. I want you to know that. Whatever I should have, I'm very proud. I covered her hand with mine, and I squeezed it once, and I did not say anything, and we stayed like that for a moment, and then the program continued, and we ate our salads. Across the table, Dennis cut his salad into careful segments and did not look at me for a while, and then he looked at me and said, that's a real thing. I said yes. He said, the 8 days. I said yes. He said, you did that. I said yes. He was quiet. Then he said, I didn't know you were doing any of that. I said, I know. He went back to his salad. After a moment he said, in a different tone, lower, less directed, more thinking out loud, I should have asked more. I didn't respond to that. There wasn't really a response that was mine to give. It was something he was saying to himself, and I let him say it. Petra ate her salad with the careful attention of a woman who is deciding what her position is. Tomas asked Marcus a question about something in the program, and they had a brief, polite exchange. Claire said quietly to Dennis, she was always, and didn't finish the sentence, and Dennis nodded like he knew what the end of it was. The rest of the dinner was not dramatic. It was, in fact, somewhat ordinary. The ordinary that settles over a table when something large has happened and everyone has agreed, without agreeing, to let the meal continue. There were remarks from a local official. There was a dessert that was competent, if not interesting. There was the low hum of 200 people having dinner, and the particular intimacy of a ballroom where the acoustics are designed for speeches, and instead are filled with conversation. My father did not say much for the rest of the evening. He was not unkind. He was not cold. He was simply much quieter than he usually was, and he looked at me a few times, in the way you look at something when you are revising the picture you have been carrying of it. At the end of the evening, when we were gathering our things, he put his hand briefly on my shoulder. Not a hug. My father does not hug easily, just his hand on my shoulder for 2 or 3 seconds, and he said, your work is something. Not I was wrong. Not I'm sorry. Not I'm proud of you. Just, your work is something. For my father, that was a great deal. I said thank you, and I meant it, and I did not press further, and I did not need to. The weeks after the ceremony had the particular texture of an aftermath, not dramatic, not clean, but the kind of slow rearrangement that happens when a structure people have been relying on turns out to be built on an inaccurate foundation. My mother called the next morning. She asked how I was feeling, which was her way of opening a conversation that was really about something else. I said I was fine, which was true. She said the evening had been beautiful. I said I thought so too. Then she said, your father was very quiet on the drive home. I said I had noticed. She said, he's been thinking. I said, good. She laughed a little. That particular sound of a woman who has navigated 50 years of a marriage to a certain man and has made peace with the texture of it. She said, he's not good at this. You know that. I said I knew. She said, he's going to need time to say things. He might not ever say all of them. I said, Mom, I know. She said, are you all right? I said, yes. I have been for a long time. She said she was glad, and I believe she was, and we talked for 20 minutes about nothing in particular, a recipe she was trying, a problem with the gutters on the house, and it was good. That conversation was genuinely good. Dennis called 2 days later. He was not a man who called often outside of coordinated family events, so this was notable. He asked if I had time to talk, and I said yes, and he said he'd been thinking about the certification, and about the work I'd been doing, and that he felt like he'd been, and then he paused and used the word Dennis would use, the careful word, uninformed. I let that sit for a moment. He said, I think I made assumptions based on what Dad, and he stopped again. I think I wasn't paying attention. I said, Dennis, it's okay. He said, is it? I thought about it. I said, it's okay in the sense that I'm not carrying it. What you do with it is your business. He said, that's fair. Then, for what it's worth, the thing you've built, that's serious work. I should have known that. I said, yes, you should have. He was quiet. Then he laughed briefly, the way you laugh when someone gives you an honest answer and you weren't quite expecting it. He said, fair enough. We talked for another few minutes. He asked if I'd ever consider consulting for construction-adjacent food service, because his firm had a client building a mixed-use development with a food hall component, and they were looking for someone who understood the operational side. I said I'd be open to a conversation. He said he'd send the details. He did. I looked at them. The project was interesting and the scope was legitimate, and I eventually took the engagement, which is its own story, but what mattered in that moment was that he asked the way you ask someone whose expertise you respect rather than the way you ask someone you're doing a favor. Petra's response came through the mechanism Petra always used for things she found complicated. She called my mother and asked my mother questions, which my mother then relayed to me over the following weeks with a diplomatic vagueness that was its own form of translation service. The questions as relayed were, was I taking on new clients? Did I ever do private event catering? And whether what I charged was, and my mother stumbled slightly here, in a range. I said I didn't do private event catering as a rule, but I could refer people. The following week Petra called me directly. First time in several months. She was warm, the warmth she used when she needed something. I had known this warmth since childhood, and had no particular animosity toward it. It was just a texture. She said she'd been meaning to call, that the ceremony had been so lovely, that she was proud of me. I said thank you. She said she was planning Tomas's 40th birthday celebration and had been thinking about doing something at home rather than a restaurant, and was wondering. She used the word wondering very carefully, whether I had any recommendations, or whether I might know anyone she could talk to. I gave her 2 names. Good people, both of them, who I trusted to do quality work. I told her they were excellent, and that she should mention my name, and they'd take good care of her. She thanked me. She paused. Then she said, Renata, I should have paid more attention to what you were doing. I know that. I said, it's okay, Petra. She said, Dad talked about it. After. He told Dennis and me that he said he'd been working with incomplete information. I almost laughed. I kept my voice steady. I said, that's a very dad way to put it. She said, yeah. Then, quieter. He meant it, I think. I said I knew, and I did know. Incomplete information was the most accurate description my father's architecture allowed, for I was wrong, and within his architecture, it was a real concession. The conversation with my father came about 3 weeks after the ceremony. He called on a Sunday morning, the time he always called, as though the shape of Sunday still organized things for him even in retirement. He asked if I had a few minutes. I said yes. He said he wanted to tell me something. I waited. He said, when you were young and later, when you were starting out, I gave you the wrong read. I waited. He said, I was measuring your work against criteria that didn't apply to it. I understand that now. I said, I know, Dad. He said, I told Marcus that you didn't have a future. He said it flatly, without inflection, the way he said things he was not proud of but was committed to saying accurately. That was wrong. I knew your work less than I thought I did. I said, you were working with incomplete information. A silence. He said, yes. Another silence. He said, your mother said I should call, but I would have called anyway. I said, I believe you. He said, you've built something real. I said, I know. He said, I should have seen it sooner. I said, you're seeing it now. He said, yes. We talked for a little while after that about his retirement project, which involved organizing 40 years of municipal records he'd kept because he'd never been able to throw anything away, about Marcus and whether we were thinking about the house question seriously, about the spring, and whether the family might do a dinner at our place sometime, an actual dinner where I cooked. I said that sounded good. he said he thought it would be. It was not a Hollywood apology. It was not the scene where the music swells and the father takes his daughter's hands and says the perfect thing. It was a man in his 70s calling his daughter on a Sunday morning and saying, in the language available to him, "I got it wrong." It was the document on the table, finally, for him, not laminated, not from the ACF, but as real as anything in that ballroom. I'll take it. Here is what I know, and what that evening confirmed for me. A credential does not give you worth. You have worth before the credential, or you don't have it after. What the credential does, what the document does, what the public moment does, is make visible what was already there. And visibility, it turns out, is the one language that reaches people who have already decided they know what they're looking at. My father needed to see the document. He needed the ACF representative and the ballroom and the 34 and the letterhead. Not because those things created something, but because they translated something into a language he could read. I spent 11 years becoming fluent in something he had no alphabet for. The ceremony gave him the alphabet. That is not a failure of love. It is a failure of imagination. And imagination, unlike love, can be corrected. That's my story. A Saturday morning with a neighbor and a spoon. An 8-day examination in a room full of evaluators who had seen every way a person could fail. And a laminated card set on a ballroom table while my father's hand went still. If you've ever built something real while the people closest to you were working with incomplete information, I want to hear about it. What was the moment they finally saw it? What was the document or the room or the sentence that changed things? Drop your answer in the comments.